In the wake of Gough Whitlam's death yesterday, the tributes and stocktakes of his legacy continue unabated. Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd was in New Delhi when he heard the news of Whitlam's death. Tonight he joins us live from the Indian capital. Kevin Rudd, thanks for being there. And what did you find yourself thinking when you heard that Gough Whitlam had died?
I think it left a gap in my heart. I think it also left a gap in the nation's heart. There's something about Gough. He seemed to be indestructible, not just in terms of his legacy, but the sheer endurance of his character and his physical presence. And with his passing, it was like a part of us had been taken away from us. That's how I felt, but I've got to say here in New Delhi, if you talk to senior political leaders, telephone calls I've had today with various Chinese officials, Gough Whitlam is remembered across the world as a great international voice for Australia.
Well, I mean, many people will be surprised, I suppose, not in this instance that you're breaking your media ban, but nonetheless, you are talking. You haven't talked for a long time.
Well, Gough Whitlam is a reason for all of us who have been in active political life to speak to his testament and to his legacy. This is a remarkable event because it's a remarkable life, and he's left an indelible impression on Australia and, I think, on our engagement with the world. It's no ordinary day. And so I, like I'm sure people like Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, feel it's part of our collective responsibility to speak and speak to this man's extraordinary legacy. I think also at a personal level, and having got to know Gough and Margaret in recent years very closely, and Therese and Margaret were very close until her unfortunate passing some time ago, it's important to recognise that first and foremost Gough Whitlam is a dad with 4 grieving kids. It doesn't matter how old you are when you pass away. We still have grief for our aged parents when they go. And I think of his family tonight in particular. I'm sure Therese does as well.
Can you describe your last meeting with him?
Well, one of the great things when I was Prime Minister, and these are the memories I choose to remember, is what I decided to do was to try and get these former Herculean characters, Whitlam, Hawke and Keating, around one dinner table at Kirribilli. And we turned this into a bit of a tradition. As you know, Paul and Bob hadn't been speaking for some time at that stage, and there are a few frictions with Gough as well. What was wonderful was to get everyone, including their wives and partners, around the table, and just to be able to honour them as a serving Australian Labor Prime Minister for their extraordinary contribution between them, but beginning with Gough. He was delighted. The other time I remember most when he was delighted was the day of the national apology. None of us will forget that photograph of Gough with the sand and the dirt going through his hand as he provided title to our Indigenous brothers and sisters for the first time. And when he was there for the national apology, the guy had a grin on his face as wide as the River Murray. It was wonderful to see, because for him, our responsibilities to the first Australians, our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, was one of the things that animated him into political life. And so I remember him shining as bright as a button on those days, and that's how Therese and I choose to remember him.
As a young boy who grew up in very modest circumstances in a small town in Queensland, who rose to become Prime Minister, do you feel you have any kind of a personal debt to Gough Whitlam and that particular government?
I think all of us who grew up in that period, if we're honest about it, have such an obligation. It's another reason for speaking out tonight. Gough did things for me. Gough did things for my ability to get on and pursue my own dreams in life. And we all know how that came about for an entire generation of Australians when he made university education accessible to everybody on the basis of ability academic ability as opposed to your ability to pay. And so in my case, my family I think had been in Australia since the Second Fleet, and so far as I can work out, I'm probably the first to ever go anywhere near a university. And Gough Whitlam made that possible for me and for so many others, opened this extraordinary array of possibilities. So for that I owe him an extraordinary debt, as to many people watching your program tonight. I also remember as a kid, Tony, as a bumptious 15-year-old, having watched Gough in the previous years head off to China, meet Mao, meet Zhou Enlai, and establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic. So after that I decided I wanted to be a diplomat. So in my scraggly Queensland high school handwriting, wrote him a letter. Of course, in the early days, you may remember, Gough was both Prime Minister and Foreign Minister at the same time. And said, "Dear Mr. Whitlam, my name's Kevin Rudd. I go to Nambour High School. I'd like very much to be an Australian diplomat. What should I do? Yours sincerely, Kevin." And to his great credit, E.G. Whitlam writes back, "Dear Kevin, it's good that you want to be an Australian diplomat. I strongly recommend you go to university first and you study a foreign language. You should look at the major languages of Asia. Yours sincerely, E.G. Whitlam, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister." So, you know, being a little Queenslander at the time, of course, when you get an authorisation from the great man from on high, we had an instinctive response to authority, so off I went.
On foreign policy, Whitlam famously said that his predecessors had represented Australia to be an insignificant, racist, militant, sycophantic country, a timid and unworthy creature of the great powers to whom it had surrendered its identity. Do you agree with that?
Well, as you know, Gough was never extravagant in his language. And, but remember what he was inheriting, for goodness sake, in 1972, and what he'd lived through since he'd been in the Parliament, through the 50s and the 60s, and so much of, let's call it a lost generation of opportunities. And when I look to his role in the world, and I look at the sheer audacity of this man taking a delegation as leader of the opposition to Communist China to make a public commitment that if they were elected, that they would recognise Communist China, and this is in the height of Cold War hysteria and anti-communist hysteria, goes home, gets attacked by the Conservatives, Billy McMahon at the time saying that Zhou Enlai had played him like a trout. And then, of course, we find out that Kissinger, not around about the same time, was in his secret diplomacy with the Chinese as well. But the sheer audacity of Gough Whitlam in doing that, the political courage in doing that, but at the same time, not just crazy brave courage, but a guy who could actually look beyond the horizon and see that this enormous phenomenon called China would have an indelible imprint on Australia's future. You've got to give credit where it's due. This is a giant of a contribution to Australia's place in the world, and with the Middle Kingdom, which now is, of course, Australia's largest economic partner.
Now, Bob Carr says that the modern Labor Party was, in every sense, a Whitlam creation. He's written this today, and that Whitlam's key legacy in that regard was that he broke the power of the left wing of the party. He did that when he delivered the impotent "Ah Pure" speech to the Victorian State Conference in 1967. Do you agree with that assessment, that the modern party is Whitlam's creation for that reason?
Look, one of Gough's other great talents was he was a permanent moderniser. He saw the continuing thread of Labor's constant values, and that is equality of opportunity, fairness for all, compassion, responsibility to your neighbours and to the world, but always applied in different circumstances as our social and economic conditions evolved. So where was Gough by the time he gets to the late 60s? He'd been deputy under Arthur Calwell. He had to deal with the 36 faceless men, 6 by 6, 6 from the 6 states. Good grief. But he took them on head-on because he knew that that institutional structure was in no way reflective of the Australia of the late 60s and early 70s. He took it on and he prevailed. And therefore the parliamentary party for the first time had an effective say in the organisation of the party. And he began therefore this process of modernisation, taking the party out of the hands of faceless backroom operators, and at the same time giving much greater voice to its elected representatives and, of course, to the members of the party more broadly as well. He was a moderniser, and within that it meant a democratiser of the party's internal operations.
I've got to ask you this, doesn't your own experience suggest that the faceless backroom operators are still pretty powerful within the Labor Party?
Well, I think one of the things I said to you before coming onto this program, Tony, is I'm not going to talk about me or anything contemporary in talking about Gough Whitlam. The purpose of tonight is to honour this extraordinary Australian. The process of modernisation of our party, any political party, continues. But what's its animating spirit? Its animating spirit is to keep the doors and the windows open to all people to be able to make an equitable contribution, an equal contribution to the party's voice and to the voice of the Australian democracy, applying our continuing good values to the evolving international, economic and social circumstances in which we find. And the world of 2014 is vastly different, of course, to the world of 1967 and to the world of 1891 when our party was first formed. The spirit of Whitlam, for all of us engaged in active politics, is if you have a sense of this fire in your belly about the core set of Labor animating values, then the challenge for your brain is to constantly apply them to the evolving practical circumstances of our time and have the courage to swim against the tide. If there's one bloke who just swam against the tide on everything, it was Gough. Party reform on the one hand, recognising China and taking us into the complex set of relationships unfolding in modern Asia, taking our troops out of Vietnam, ending conscription, supporting the equal pay case for women, for God's sake, appointing Australia's first women's policy advisor, which Jenny Hocking described as then in her book as setting off almost a national reaction of small men syndrome right across the country at the time. I mean, these were all swimming against the tide, but with a guy who could see across the horizon, see where we needed to go, and said, "Oi, come on troops, let's go there," always being held back by a bunch of people who preferred their own little dung heap at the time, whether it was factional or otherwise. So that's why I'm such an admirer of the guy. I think he's a Labor legend, arguably one of our greatest leaders, probably our greatest leader.
He spent 20 years in Parliament before he became Prime Minister, 5.5 of them as opposition leader. Do you agree with Bill Shorten that one of the key lessons, in fact, about his rise to power was the time that he had to not only develop policies but to sell them to the public? For example, the Medibank policy legislation, he spent years before he was elected Prime Minister selling to the public. Could you imagine that sort of thing happening today?
Well, probably not, because you folks in the media get bored after the second day. And whereas in Gough's period, where you were still, frankly, campaigning on street corners and in radio interviews, extensive ones, and it wasn't a 7-second grab in those days, Tony, it was maybe sort of a 35-second grab, then it was probably more possible in those circumstances than it is today. What you've got to admire about Gough as the party moderniser is this. Gough realised that having fire in your belly is one thing about Labor values, values for all Australians, not just for some, being a moderniser and making sure that our project was fit to the circumstances of the time, but then actually having this disciplined program by which you got there. So you're right, in opposition, what's he do? He develops a full policy platform which he launches for the 72 election campaign. One of the, I think it was Kim Beazley at the time, Senior, who described it as the New Testament, the formal party platform approved by the conference. Well, that was the Old Testament. And then you had this extraordinary transition to government document, which was developed by the great Peter Walensky. This was a systematic approach to the business of preparing policy for government, preparing for transition, and then implementing the program. Of course, one of the tragedies which Gough faced was not long into his term in office. Then you have this extraordinary assault on the global economy delivered by the first oil shock and the massive inflationary forces that unleashed across all developed economies at the time. So he faced challenges, we all do, but we admire him for what he's able to do in the circumstances and the hand that he was dealt.
Well, those challenges, of course, led to some chaotic decision-making, including the loans affair, and, of course, the opposition at the time took huge advantage of that. In 2012, in a speech to launch Jenny Hocking's Whitlam biography, you spoke passionately about what you call the utter ruthlessness of Conservative politics in gaining power, of the absolute political brutality of the dismissal. Do you still believe it was unconstitutional?
Utterly. Anyone who seriously reviews the period knows that it was an unconstitutional act, and we all know that it was a perfectly constitutional means by which to resolve that crisis at the time, which after all had been brought about by the Conservatives embarking on a policy to block supply in the Senate. We know that this could have been resolved either A, by Conservative senators buckling, which they were in the process of doing, or B, waiting for a half-central election, which at that stage was due in early 1976. But no, the Conservatives at the time decided that they would just have this naked lunge for power, and off they went. And the fact that this has been such a stain in the Australian political record, the Australian constitutional record, and that you can find barely a Conservative today who will stand up for it in its defence, I think speaks volumes.
Now, given what we now know about manoeuvrings behind the scenes in the High Court, do you give any weight to the old theories that this was in fact a conspiracy?
Oh, look, I'm not going to go beyond what I've just said. It's just that, remember, by all reports that we have seen, Her Majesty the Queen was profoundly disturbed by the actions of John Kerr in response to the advice that he received from wherever. So let's not sort of delve into sub-conspiracy and sub-conspiracy. We all know there was a normal means for unlocking that crisis at the time. The crisis had been brought about by the Conservatives. They were determined to tip Gough Whitlam's government out of power, and they did so. And I think both sides of politics have learnt from that since then, and alternative conventions have been put in place. But what is important to reflect upon through all of that is, despite Gough's extraordinary pain at what happened and what he didn't deserve to happen to him, was his extraordinary resilience as a person coming through that. As a kid at the Australian University, I remember in the late 70s seeing the great man who had just ceased being leader of the opposition after the 77 election, striding across the lawn in front of the Coombs building, purposefully embarked upon his next project. And there he was, since 77, right through until his passing this year, constantly engaged in the business of encouraging Labor to pick itself up, dust itself off and get back into the business of developing policy for all Australians, providing opportunity for all, campaigning relentlessly on his question of ensuring that we have equitable electoral boundaries across the country, and encouraging individual members of Parliament. For me and for many others, we all got our notes from Gough when we were backbenchers. Dear Kevin, I read your speech on such and such a date, a fine effort. I think you should have phrased the penultimate paragraph better, yours sincerely, Gough Whitlam, to going out to wherever you were in the country, helping you in a local fundraiser, in my case, opening my electorate office, for goodness sake.
Okay.
I mean, this was an extraordinary gift, which he had after the event, to encourage people in the movement. He did not enmesh himself the embitterment which would normally have flowed from having been unconstitutionally dismissed.
Now, we haven't got much time, but you mentioned what led up to the dismissals. I've got to ask you this. In 73, the coalition leader in the Senate, Reg Withers, actually described the Whitlam government as an aberration, an illegitimate government, that the election was a temporary political insanity. And when you did that speech at the book launch, you described all of this as being part of a universal Conservative playbook. Are you suggesting there's some sort of continuity between the Conservatives in those days and the Conservatives in these days?
I have no intention whatsoever on this occasion, when we're honouring Gough, to enter into the current debates in contemporary Australian politics. That's for others to prosecute, and I'll leave it to them. But the point of the time, and you've just quoted Reg Withers, who I think was leader of the opposition in the Senate at the time, plainly from day one, just after the Whitlam government was elected, saying this is an aberration, it's illegitimate, and we're going to resort to any means to get rid of it, including, Withers floated at the time, using their numbers in the Senate. And so, at the time, and representing a certain thread in conservative view, that non-conservative governments were somehow by definition illegitimate, and that the natural parties of government were those representing conservative interests. Of course, where the Australian heart lies, and lay then, is in parties of the compassionate and reforming centre who were mindful of the challenges that we faced in the world, in the economy, but still committed with an open heart to giving opportunity for all. That's what Gough Whitlam stood for, through thick and thin, and despite this enormous conservative fuselage unleashed against him.
Kevin Rudd, we'll have to leave you. Interesting to hear you again after such a long time off the screen. Nice to have you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tony, to talk about E.G. Whitlam, great Australian.